Howdy Cape Codders, welcome to the Scannell Agenda. This is show number 4. The date is September 6th, 2013. I'll be bouncing around today talking about a few different things, but one of the things I want to explain is my efforts to bring back the bay scallops, coastwise. That's just not for any particular town such as Nantucket or Denison, Yarmouth was Bass River and Chatham and Westport, Massachusetts, and a lot of towns in Massachusetts had bay scallops as well, Rhode Island, and then go down the coast, Connecticut. There's been, the bay scallops are missing in action right now, basically. Nantucket has them, the Vineyard has them. It's too sporadic. And there's reasons why they're gone. We have to figure all this out. And then there's things that have to be done to bring back the bay scallop, and we got to figure all that out. And this will be a good exercise for us to go into the major leagues and really get into offshore fishery management with the, codfish and different lobster, flounders. And we should be able to tackle rebuilding the bay scallop fisheries. And I think if we can do that, we'll be in good shape. On the last show, I discussed the Presidential Scallop Hotel. Now, I really didn't get into the marine laboratories, but that's a pretty big component of what we were talking about. And as I said, I did work at the Nantucket Marine Laboratory. That was in a Coast Guard boathouse on Nantucket. And it was a demonstration project, and it fizzled due to politics after a very short effort on Nantucket's part. That never should have happened. That should have kept going. But due to bad politics, it just fizzled. A damn shame. So floating marine labs for the Presidential Scallop Hotel and for other purposes would be barge-based operations, and they would be moored or docked, possibly 3 sizes of these vessels, probably not as big as the hull of that aquaculture factory ship that I showed you, but maybe that would be the large size. That might be a good hull to use, but make it a prettier boat, please. I need some help. That's an ugly boat. We could design a nice boat, and it could be a Herreshoff designed hull. That'd be nice. Something nice to look at. You don't want to look at something ugly down there at the waterfront. That's just torturing people for no good reason. No good reason to do that. So I apologize for that, the shape of that hull. All right. You can roast me. That'd be fine. Now, the floating marine labs would have some essentials. Most of them would be tied into lots of plumbing and tankage to do hatchery work, but maybe a few of them would have none of that, and they would be more or less oriented towards fishing gear, habitat work, nursery work, other things. So they all don't have to be hatchery facilities. As basic components, they need to be tourist friendly. Every single area where we are going to be rebuilding the bay scallop fishery, and that is these beautiful little scallops here. Every single area where we're going to be rebuilding this fishery is a tourist area by nature. You go up and down the coast everywhere from Provincetown to all the towns in Connecticut that have had bay scallops for many years. And, the people are dying out that remember those good old days. Especially because of this, we had something called a wasting disease. And that was back in the early 1930s. And what the wasting disease was a blight on the eelgrass. Now, your eelgrass got wiped out, about 90%, 95%, they say, between Europe and the East Coast here. that really hurt the bay scallop fishery badly, and that was in 1930 and 1931. Now, I have talked to the old-timers in my youth who remember going through that period and living through that period. In fact, I'll just touch on one guy. His name was Louis Pina. My first job was, and these are the bay scallops here. Aren't they beautiful little shells? There's nothing prettier, really. The thing of it is, see, as a kid, you know, I met this guy named Louis Pina. It was my first job pumping gas downtown in Harwichport at BP. Now, he was an old Cape Verdean. He came to Cape Cod in the year 1900, and he was 15 years old. His first job was on a coastal whaler. And later on, he did things like building cranberry bogs and, you know, farming and gardening and fishing. So his whole life was fishing and farming. And nice Cape Verdean guy. But I made his face turn red. I remember once pushing his buttons. I was 14, you know, I was into fisheries back then too. You know, I thought aquaculture was the answer and we could just sprinkle scallops out there and then we'd have a scallop fishery. And he said, no, you had to have eelgrass, and I explained to him, I mean, bear in mind, he's 90-something years old, and here I am, 14, explaining to him that hatchery work, we can, you know, throw out all the seed out there. It was kind of comical, but he did get a little hot under the collar. I made his face turn red. He was so ticked off, but he had a lot of patience, and I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot about eelgrass from him. So one of the components of rebuilding the bay scallop fishery coastwise is eelgrass. It's huge. It's got to be bigger than your hatchery work. That's the habitat. So there are 4 sections, and I really loved Louis. I used to visit him quite often. You know, he had a big garden, and he used to tell me all his stories, and I loved it. He gave me a lot, and the old-timers gave me a lot. Couple others were Phil Schwind. I took a course from him in aquaculture. He's an old-timer from Eastham. He wrote some books, Practical Shellfish Farming. So I knew at a young age when I was a kid that this is what I wanted to do. And of course I mentioned Harry Hunt in one of the other shows. Just really smart people that, you know, I'm not smart, but if you hang around smart people, maybe a little bit will rub off on you. That's, you know, I mean, that's that's a theory. Anyway, on Nantucket, I kind of warmed up to people like Charlie Sales, old man Charlie Sales, and George Andrews. Charlie Sales was a guy who was pretty bitter about the way fisheries was going in the 20s and 30s, and you know, so he had a lot of stories, and he knew the old ways, and he was an old fisherman. He did a lot of scrim shandering and model making. I'm sure if he were looking down from heaven and saw that model that I just showed you on the last show, he'd be turning over. And then George Andrews was a really cool fisherman. I used to, when I go dragging once in a while, I'd bring him dogfish. That's all he wanted. No, I couldn't bring him anything else. All he wanted was dogfish. You know, and dogfish is delicious. We can get into that in some other show. We're under bay scallops here. We need to mimic and copy the striped bass revival that happened in the early 80s. And that used a 4-disciplined approach: fisheries rules and fishery management, aquaculture, water quality, and habitat. I think habitat's the biggest for this bay scallop thing. Now, I've got a lot of work done on designing eelgrass planting and eelgrass cultivation, which includes tire reefs to protect the eelgrass beds that you've just planted. So none of this is really simple. It takes a lot of thinking through if you want to have bay scallops. But the eelgrass is a huge component, and part of that component is grading the soil or the substrate that the eelgrass is going to be in, protecting it from overwash, nurturing the eelgrass, and then comes your water quality work, where we have to, you know, get involved with the failed septic systems and various water quality issues from bottom paint to you name it. Water quality is big. And that's a big component of rebuilding the bay scallop fishery. Habitat has to do with the eelgrass, but it has also to do with things like your little mud crabs and the interactions between the fish that forage through, like your tautog and scup and sea bass, that will eat the critters, that eat the larval scallops, et cetera, and even things like eels that burrow into your eelgrass. Those are all big factors. You really want to concentrate on knowing your eelgrass environment is big. It's huge with trying to bring back the bay scallops, but we can do it. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And these marine labs will be given the task of rebuilding the bay scallop fishery and other fisheries. But the quintessential mantelpiece item in fisheries management is having a bay scallop fishery. There's no other fishery that really compares to having bay scallops, because you can go out and be back with your limit by 8:30 in the morning when the fishing's good. There's nothing better than fishing when fishing is really good. There's nothing that beats it. And with bay scallops, of course, then you'd have to shuck them or open them or cut them out. So it's really a great fishery to have in your town, in my town. There was a guy named Belding who did a lot of work in 1909, and he said that Harwich had a tremendous potential for bay scallops. And if you look at the grounds, potentially maybe Harwich could be one of the bigger bay scallop producers. But right now, the stock in Harwich, and you can tell this by looking at shells on the beach, is very narrow. One of the projects I had on Nantucket, which was not well received, and this is an understatement, was to bring what I called Scannell bushels, which was a bushel of seed scallops mixed with whatever's on the bottom, including the seaweed, and rush it over to, you'd have to pick a town, and you'd rush this scallop, these scallop bushels over, maybe 500 or 1,000 of these. I called them Scannell bushels because they're all mixed up with seaweed and you know, the seed scallops. And the whole thing would be speed. And you transfer these scallops over to one area, such as Red River off of South Harwich, that has some good potential for scallops. But the stock is just so narrow there, I don't think it can really get going. You need a broad stock, genetically. Now, once you got to do that, you've got to protect and cultivate your eelgrass. You've got to make sure that your predators are under control. You've got to see to it that there's fish in the environment, because the fish are going to be what forages through on your eelgrass beds. So if you clean out all the fish, and this is probably the primary reason why the bay scallop fishery collapsed. Because in the early 80s, basically there were no more inshore fish. You know, scup, tautog, sea bass, even flounder, everything that comes in and forages. These are critical components of the ecosystem machine. You can't remove critical components on your car either. Just in case you thought you could remove fish from the ocean and then have bay scallops and have everything you want, doesn't work that way. These things are like machines. So I can remember on Nantucket, oh man, it was scary to see our bay scallop fishery come down to its knees, and then to have the stock genetically switch over from producing spat in the fall to producing spat in the spring. Mattocket and town switched. Oh, it was scary. We came, I mean, the fishery almost collapsed. We came within 1/8 of an inch of collapsing many years ago on Nantucket. But somehow we bounced back because I think the fish were coming back in, and the fish were able to prevent the collapse, because the fish would be coming in and foraging on even little things like these sea lice that you would see on a mooring back then that would be covered. And your larval scallops just didn't have a chance with no fish in the ocean, because the fish's job is to forage on all the little critters that forage on the larval and the tiny little bay scallops. And the same rules are true offshore. You can't push around Mother Nature, because she's just, you know, Mother Nature wants what she's always had. That's the first thing we got to learn. So those 4 disciplines are critical. Aquaculture, fisheries management, water quality, habitat. And we can use a striped bass comeback model. I met the guy that kind of wrote the book on it years ago. He's gone now. But that's the model we want. These disciplines have to be all orchestrated at once. And if you don't do that, if you're missing on one of your cylinders, it ain't going to work. So we can bring back the bay scallops. And this is the fishery to bring back, because the reason why is because we can do it. It's a tough fishery because, especially from an aquaculture perspective, your scallops, your bay scallops are about 10 times more delicate to raise in captivity than an oyster. Oysters live in the intertidal zone. Oysters are they're tremendously hardy and tough, unlike a scallop. But, unlike a scallop, an oyster will mature in, 3 or 4 years. And they're both different animals. They're both important components. We should be concentrating on oysters too. I'm not saying we shouldn't concentrate on everything, but if we really press and get good at the bay scallop revival, it's just gonna make a lot of these other fisheries a lot easier to rebuild. This is kind of like the canary in the coal mine. You bring back the bay scallops, and a lot will follow. And you get people that are good at reviving the bay scallop industry, so-called, or the habitat, etc. And then, these other fisheries will fall into place, I believe. And that includes herring, clams, and quahogs, and a lot of other fisheries. All right. We're going to use the market quota system, hopefully, and take a 20% fee for the bay scallops, because we'll be putting in a lot more subsidies than 20%. A lot more. This is going to take a huge concerted effort. These presidential scallop hotels, the marine laboratories. Of course, it's not all for the bay scallops, but that'll be the first goal, I hope. More about the market quota system. It's a generic economic system. Don't confuse it with a fishery management plan. And don't confuse it with anything weird like communism or fascism or the government's taken over or anything like that. This is a production system, folks. We need a production system in fishery management. We desperately need a production system, and we got to get away from these failed patronage systems. Now, because it's a generic system, using the carrot and stick, we're going to be able to use the market quota system to trend away from destructive fishing practices and to trend away from private ownership of the public commons in fisheries. That means no more, with the market quota system, no more long-term privately held fisheries assets. It's all public treasury stuff. And you pay a rental fee. That's called your tax, your market quota system tax. So it would be an end of an era. Now, we do need to phase down our fisheries destruction. So as I mentioned on the first show, I believe we need an 80% shutdown of fisheries. And in that we can do, a good 80% shutdown. And perhaps for, 7 years or so. And then all the while buying down two things: the destructive capacity of bad methods in fisheries and private ownership. We got to buy down both of those things at once, over a 7-year period and then finish it out in the next 10 years. So you're looking at long-term, multi-billion-dollar expenditures to buy down what the public gave for free to fishermen, ostensibly because the public thought fishermen could do it. There was no deal on the table to look at that suggested fishermen could do it and produce seafood. And this was in the early 80s or mid-70s that this all started up. Of course, the kids want to own the candy store, and you let them, the public let them, and it just didn't work out. So we need a good 7-year rest, an 80% shutdown. During that period of time, we can allow a lot of species to get bumped up and some to bump them down too. And that's a topic for another show. How do you put pressure on some species and let others come up? And then how do you justify doing that? Well, for instance, cod has a broodstock value. And you could say the broodstock value economically were between $50 and $150 a pound for the codfish swimming in the ocean now. That's more or less fisheries management actuarial appraisal of the value of the cod in the ocean now. But to a fisherman, the value of the codfish in the ocean now is that, yeah, I got to go catch the fish. I got to pay for my boat, which is not nothing. I'm not saying it's nothing. It shouldn't be minimized or maximized. But it's like the candy store analogy works right now because we don't have cod. And that's a major problem. And it's because the public wants to be nice to fishermen. That's a major problem. The public should be called upon here to find someone better at leading for the cause of fisheries production, and that's me, Stephen J. F. Scannell, fisherman, put in the corner, basically. But I'm still a fisherman, but kind of sidetracked. I was fishing the day the cops took me away, but never mind that right now. Got to stay on topic here, and that is rebuilding the bay scallop fishery. When we rebuild the bay scallop fishery, and we use the market quota system to do that, and as a reference, fisheries management done properly, you better have a leader to do that, and that is me, I hope. And other people, the cream will rise to the top, because over the years, I've seen a lot of fishermen who really understood gardening and making a garden grow and cultivation. And some fishermen basically understood that, you know, they got to go out and fish and catch the fish and bring it home and sell it. And beyond that, there wasn't a lot of understanding. So I'm asking the public to take responsibility. And maybe Cape Cod can sign a pledge to bring back the bay scallops and the codfish and to bring back fishing. And we can also write an apology of no codfish, the Cape Cod no codfish cod apology, and we can take that to Nebraska and apologize to the people of Nebraska. If you'd like to send me to do that, I'll write that up for us. Sometimes you got to know you hit the bottom of the barrel, and when fishermen can't even go out and catch their limit of codfish, and we're called Cape Cod, I mean, something should be waking us up here. So we basically, using this limited entry system of fisheries, it's basically on the same level as selling the national park system. You know, might make some right-wing guy happy like Milton Friedman or Barry Goldwater. In the dark ages, there were some people that wanted to sell the national parks. Now, giving away fishing rights the way we did was on that same level, and we've got to knock that off. We've got to nip it in the bud because the world followed the United States of America, and we messed up pretty badly. So we've got to fix that. So that's the Scannell agenda, and that's all about designing these systems, and these are whether it's public aquaculture or using a bay scallop dredge that doesn't hurt the bottom, and knowing when to shut the beds off when you've caught 50, 60, 70% of those scallops off that bed. You know you got to shut that bed down and say, that's enough. Let that eelgrass come back etc., etc. I do design work all day long. I mean, I could be driving a bus around in a circle or doing something else. That's what I've been doing for many years, since I've been put in the corner. And so I figured, well, I have to somehow earn my dinner. So this is what I've been doing for many years. So I hope to get your support. And maybe on the next show we'll talk about bringing back the herring. And maybe we can reminisce if we have some young fishermen that can describe their mentors and how their mentors helped them. It's been a great life for me as a fisherman. So I just hope to bump it up and get into fishery management on a serious level and to lead the world into production. And the market quota system has every bit of what it takes to do that. Okay, that's the Scannell agenda. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cape Codders.